Hi, I'd like to spend the next few minutes in conversation with you about Aristides and his apology to Emperor Hadrian. To do this, let's answer a few questions first. Who was Aristides, and what's an apology? Aristides was born in Athens, Greece, but we're not sure exactly when. He died around 133 to 134 in the Common Era. He practiced philosophy, and after Aristides converted into Christianity, he continued to do so. Aristides is best known for his apology, which was addressed to the Roman Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian ruled from 1117 to 1138, and we think that the apology was written somewhere around the year 125. He is remembered and venerated by the Church for his contributions to early Christian apologetics and for his defense of Christian beliefs. And now, what's an apology? An apology in this context is not saying you're sorry. It's a defense of a belief. Aristides' apology was written explaining and defending the Christian faith. And now that we've done that, let's dig in. An analysis of Aristides' apology reveals flawed reasoning and irrational arguments used in defense of early Christians and in criticism of pagans in the 2nd century. And such thinking parallels a pattern of incomplete and irrational reasoning used by we Christians today. Aristides wrote his famous apology in defense of Christianity and critiquing other religions. He highlighted the ethical and the moral superiority of Christianity in his apology. But when he did this, he made some claims and he presented them as true, and the examples, they needed fact-checking. And unfortunately, we have that same tendency today. It's easy to find everything wrong with someone that we have deemed the enemy, and to gloss over things about ourselves instead of using that same critical lens. So I'm going to show you how Aristides did it in the 2nd century with people who didn't worship the way he did, and how we do the same today to denigrate others. For a little historical context, in the 2nd century when Aristides lived, most of the people were pagan. Jews and Jewish Christians worshipped an invisible God, and because of this, many pagans considered them to be atheists. Aristides writes to the Emperor of Rome to explain that Christians are not atheists, and he does this by showing that the pagans are atheists. Remember earlier when I said that Aristides' day job was a philosopher? His letter to Emperor Hadrian uses logical reasoning that we find in philosophical proofs. Philosophy isn't about asserting beliefs, it's about defending them. I'm allowed to believe anything I like, and so are you. But if I think that you should believe the things that I do, then I have to give reasons why I ought to hold that belief with logic. This is what Aristides is doing. He's using deductive logic to prove that pagans are atheists because their gods aren't real gods. So deductive logic was discovered by this guy named Aristotle, and here's how it works. All relationships between types of things can be expressed in one of 4 ways. And for anything at all, it turns out that at least one of these sentences is always true. All S are P, some S are P, no S are P, some S are not P. Now, S and P are just placeholders. You plug other things into those, like this. All guitars are instruments. Some guitars are instruments. No guitars are instruments. Some guitars are not instruments. At least one of these must be correct. In this case, it's that all guitars are instruments. Let's move on to arguments. If you string premises together into an argument, then you end up with a conclusion that must be true if the premises are true. All A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore, all A's are C's. Now, we plug things into those placeholders. All cappuccinos are coffee. All coffee are beverages. Therefore, all cappuccinos are beverages. And you can keep going. If you start with a true premise and continue to add more true premises, then you can add dozens and the conclusion is still true. But there's a catch. If one premise is untrue, the whole conclusion falls apart. Like this. All cappuccinos are coffee. All coffee are beverages. All beverages are served cold. Therefore, all cold beverages are cappuccino. Now, let's take a look at what Aristides, the philosopher, has to say. He begins with the premise that includes God is not born and not made, without beginning and without end, immortal. And he also says, form he has none, and adversary he has none, for there exists not any stronger than he. So he begins by setting up an argument of what God should be by using these premises. And then he uses evidence and examples, also found in philosophical proofs, to show how several pagan gods and idols cannot logically be considered a god given that premise. And if this is the case, then it logically follows that the pagans are actually atheists, not the Christians. Now, moving to Aristides' first example, let's take a look. Aristides uses the example of barbarians, as they were called, who worshipped things instead of their creator. And they made images and idols, and they put them in shrines. The shrines were guarded so that the idols wouldn't be stolen by robbers. And he holds this example up to his premise that God is not born and not made. The barbarians created idols to worship, but if God is not made, then a man-made idol cannot be a god. His premise also says, adversary he has none, for there exists not any stronger than he. So true God would never be overtaken by a mere robber. And if guards could protect God, then they would be stronger. And the god must not be a god. Therefore, the barbarians must be atheists, because they don't worship a god. Moving on to the Greeks, Aristides says that the Greeks brought forth a god as Kronos, who had children with his wife, Rhea. But he went mad because of a prophecy that he had been given, so he swallowed his children so that none could overthrow him, as the prophecy predicted. Baby Zeus was stolen away without Kronos knowing. An adult Zeus faced Kronos and, according to Aristides' apology, mutilated the signs of his manhood and flung them into the sea. And then Zeus cast Kronos out into the darkness. So Aristides' premise, you remember, says, form he has none, and adversary he has none, for there is none stronger than he. And since Kronos was mutilated by Zeus, then Kronos cannot be a god, because that would give him a form, and because it would mean someone else was stronger and able to defeat him. But Aristides got the example wrong. It's a half-truth presented as a truth. Zeus didn't castrate Kronos. Kronos did it to his father, Uranus. Kronos wasn't mutilated at all. He was sent into Tartarus. And remember, if one part of the logical argument is invalid and untrue, then the conclusion isn't true. So Aristides' claim that Kronos isn't a god, it falls apart. Let's say, for example, a present-day group of people wanted to use the example of conversion therapy curing LGBT plus individuals, and they cited 3 anecdotal success stories as examples. Well, these stories present distorted information that is counter to evidence from the APA and from medical studies. The APA's official position is, following a growing body of evidence of the potential harms and lack of efficacy of conversion therapies, leading professional healthcare bodies have concluded that conversion therapies lack efficacy and may carry significant risks of harm. Additionally, the Minnesota Department of Health notes that conversion therapy is based on the now discredited belief that being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer is an illness that should be cured. This conclusion does not support the rationale for employing conversion therapies as a cure. Most medical professionals, mental health professionals, and faith leaders concur that sexual orientation change efforts are both ineffective and harmful. I'm not going to get into the curing right now. The point here is the evidence given. It's incomplete. At best, it's a half-truth that's presented as a fact. And a true premise plus an untrue premise equals a conclusion that doesn't hold water. I'll wrap up by talking about Aristides' philosophical argument about Hercules. In his apology, Aristides says, Hercules they bring forward and say that he is a god and a warrior. And of him, they say he killed his own children, and he cast himself into a fire and died. In his premise, you remember, he says that God is without beginning and without end, immortal. So if God is immortal and Hercules was killed in a fire, then he couldn't be a god. And this forwards his goal of proving that the pagans are atheists because they didn't worship a god, even though the pagans claim that the Christians are atheists. But again, Aristides got the example wrong. Hercules wasn't a god. He never claimed to be. His father was Zeus, but his mother was mortal. So he's a hero, not a god. If you're a Percy Jackson fan, then Hercules would be at Camp Half-Blood. Hercules was poisoned. It hurt him, but it didn't kill him. So he built his own funeral pyre, and he climbed into the fire to die and end the pain. When he died, he was taken to Mount Olympus, and then the gods granted him immortality and made him a god among the pantheon. But the order of operations is important here, and Aristides skewed that to further his own aim. To draw a present-day parallel, we can use the church's argument that gay marriage destroys traditional families. An article gives biblical reasons why traditional marriages and families should be upheld and not gay marriage. Now, I won't go into all of the reasons. You're welcome to read the article for yourself. My focus is on traditional. A traditional family as we know it today is only a few generations old. It wasn't until around the 1950s that we saw nuclear families in a household together. Before World War II, it was common for multiple generations and extended family to live together near one another. Historian Kristin Dumez notes, by the 1950s, the baby boom was in full swing and the traditional family appeared to be flourishing. The nuclear family structured around a male breadwinner was in fact of recent invention, arising in the 1920s and peaking in the 1950s and 60s. Before then, multi-generational families relying on multiple contributors to the family economy had been the norm. Traditional is new, not biblical. It's only as old as my grandparents' generation, but it's presented as biblical to further the aim. Religious apologetics and flawed logic have been well acquainted for centuries, and the harm it has done is incalculable as we see it continuing today in the assault on the LGBT community.